Now, some of you have heard about adenoviruses. These are the viruses that Johnson & Johnson uses as their base, or the quote virus that they put their sequences into. It's a so-called carrier virus. So I thought I would take a quick look and see, where do they get this virus from? And so here's a paper. You can see the journal article here. Not sure when it was. Just to read it. From the present evidence, it appears that an unidentified, possibly new tissue culture cytopathic agent has been isolated repeatedly from human adenoids undergoing spontaneous degeneration in tissue culture. The filterability and the inability to cultivate the agent on bacteriological medium and to demonstrate organisms in stained tissue culture would indicate that the agent belongs to a group of virus or rickettsia, otherwise they would see it. It is tentatively proposed to designate the agent as adenoid degeneration agent, abbreviated AD. That agent is derived from adenoid tissue rather than the nutrient medium, is indicated by the fact that some adenoids and all human embryonic tissues cultivated in the identical medium and at the same time have not undergone degeneration, although they are susceptible to infection with the agent. Also, repeated attempts to isolate the agents from the adenoid cultures not demonstrating degeneration have been uniformly unsuccessful. Further investigation is in progress to determine the relationship of the agent to the adenoids and to study their possible role in human disease, particularly upper respiratory infections. So what they just told you is they could, when you have adenoid tissue, that's the lymph tissue up in your back of your throat, when that's undergoing adenoid degeneration because they're sick and breaking down, then you find the virus. And if they're not breaking down, then you don't find the virus. So an adenovirus is basically broken down adenoid tissue that they mix with the usual cell cultures, and that's what they're talking about. So when they stick a RNA sequence in an adenovirus, they're basically just co-culturing it with degenerated, diseased adenoid tissue that's grown in a toxic soup, and they're not putting anything in any virus because obviously they never found a virus. They're just giving you broken down, diseased, somebody's sick adenoids. And that's not what I would call an appetizing supper. Next little subject. What about antibodies? And I must admit, I looked at this right before, and I don't remember where I got this from, but these were 4 quotes about antibodies. For those of you who still think that antibodies have something to do with so-called immune system, that antibodies are somehow specific to any disease or any virus. So let's take a look at these quotes. And again, I don't even remember where they came from, unfortunately. Sorry about that. I believe there's hardly an element of truth in a single one of the basic hypotheses embodied in this theory. That's the antibody theory. My conviction with there was something radically wrong with it arose from a consideration of the almost universal failure of therapeutic methods based on it. 12 years of study with immunophysical tests have yielded a mass of experimental information contrary to and irreconcilable with the Ehrlich theory. That's the original antibody theory. And have convinced me that this conception of the origin, nature, and physiological role of the specific antibodies is erroneous. In other words, there are no specific antibodies, and they have no role in preventing infection. Here's another interesting take on that. For example, it became well known that children with A-gamma globulinemia who can't make antibodies, who consequently have no capacity to produce antibodies after contracting measles or other zymotic diseases, nonetheless recover with long-lasting immunity. In his view, it was clear that a variety of other immunological mechanisms are functioning without the benefit of actively producing antibodies. In other words, even if you think measles is a disease, you can find people who can't make antibodies and still don't go through what we all know is the cleansing process of measles more than once in their life. So obviously the antibodies have nothing to do with immunity. The next one, mid-century British investigation on the relationship of the incidence of diphtheria to the presence of antibodies. The study concluded that there were no observable correlation between high antibody count and the incidence of the disease. Quote, the researchers found people who were highly resistant with low antibody count and people who developed the disease who had high antibody count. And there's a reference, I don't know where it is right now. And I've seen this over and over with tetanus and just about any disease and that's so-called, you get so-called immunity to. It turns out when you actually run the numbers, people who have no immunity don't get it. People who have high antibodies or no antibodies don't get it. People who have high antibodies do get it, just confirming that antibodies have nothing to do with so-called immunity. And then the final one, the New England Journal of Medicine provides evidence for the position that immunity to disease is a broader bioecological question than the factors of artificial immunization or serology. They summarily concluded, it is important to stress that immunity or its absence cannot be determined reliably on the basis of the history of the disease, history of immunization, or history of prior serological determination. In other words, if you actually do the research, there's no evidence that the history of the disease, whether you've been so-called immunized or any blood tests, actually determines whether you will get that disease or you have any resistance to it. So the whole thing just kind of falls apart. Once again, proving that antibodies are just repair substance. They don't prove this antibodies are repair substance, but they prove that they have nothing to do with, quote, immunity to disease, and they have some other role, which we're postulating, or at least I am, has to do with repairing diseased tissue.